as we got into it, and the more times we visited Argentina, the more people we met in Argentina, the more files we discovered, the more newspaper reports we looked at from the time, it became pretty obvious that the death in the bunker was nothing but, well, fiction. Or maybe somebody died in the bunker, but it wasn't Adolf Hitler.
Or is it that that's what a lot of people would have liked to have believed, and that's how they would have liked the history to be written? And we remember how Hugh Trevor Roper was duped by the Hitler diaries.
I mean, I have no idea why Hugh Trevor Roper was actually chosen by the Secret Services to do the death of Hitler. I mean, the guy was an Oxford academic. He had been listening to radio inserts all war, and yet they put him into Germany and Berlin to write the definitive intelligence report on the death of Hitler. Why they didn't put Scotland Yard in, or some of the best detectives of our time, I don't know.
However, I mean, there are other historians, Alan Bullock, of course, Hitler's biographer, and then more recently Sir Ian Kershaw, who say, look, the evidence that Hitler committed suicide and then his body in Eva Braun's was burnt, either as a result of deliberate action or by shell fire, that the evidence is there. I mean, what weight of evidence have you got now to actually balance that argument?
I think it's likely that somebody died in the bunker, but I don't think it was Hitler. We have the testimony from a Warsaw court of the pilot who flew them out. He went to court in 1947, gave details of who he'd flown out, where he'd flown from, and where he flew them to. The judge in Warsaw at the time thought, you really are joking, you have to be, so sent him away for psychological testing. 6 months later, they brought him back into court. He said exactly the same thing. He was extremely detailed. We have the testimony from an SS officer on the ground in Denmark who saw the plane arrive and Hitler and Eva Braun get out with other passengers. We have what I think is an overwhelming amount of evidence that shows that Adolf Hitler survived, got to Argentina. His daughter later joined them there.
Now, there is the interesting fact, the daughter, and therefore you've got DNA evidence. Has that actually been pursued to try and provide some concrete evidence that might stand up in a criminal trial, for instance?
I think, well, there can't be any criminal trial. I mean, Hitler was never even accused of anything. He was dead.
Well, although he was the world's greatest criminal.
I know, amazing, really. I think the two daughters are still alive. One was born in Argentina at the end of 1945, and one was born in Germany, or possibly Italy, in 1938, and came out to join them later. There are numerous reports that Eva Braun was pregnant in the bunker before they left. To try and go after these people, or to go after the children of these people, and over 30,000 Nazis and fascists escaped to Latin America after the war. I don't know whether it's really our job or my job. It's the history, you know, the children's sins.
If the evidence was there, why haven't the Nazi hunters, Wiesenthal and his like, actually gone down this trail before?
I think
because it's been so well hidden.
That's a really good question. You have to remember that Argentina was pretty much a fascist dictatorship until the early 80s.
Perón was supported, of course, by the Nazis.
Well, we have evidence that is presented in the book that both Perón and Eva were Nazi spies from 1941 in the pay of Abwehr, the military intelligence organization of the Nazis. I don't know why people didn't go after them. One, he was dead, so I suppose, you know, why bother? And secondly, you know, it took almost 11.5 years for the Americans to find bin Laden. And they knew he was alive, and they knew where he was. And, you know, it took them a long time to find him.
And would the argument be that even though he might be alive, it's more convenient for them to actually just establish the fact that he is dead?
I think a deal was done in 1944, early 1945, to get Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler and Gestapo Müller out of Germany. And the deal was done with senior members of the American intelligence services and a very few industrialists who knew this was going on as well.
To what, to get their hands on rocket technology and
in part, yes, but I also think that the Americans, or these Americans, saw the Cold War coming, and they thought that it may be very handy to have the Nazi leadership in place as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Of course, when they found out what these murdering swine had done, and the extent of the Holocaust, you couldn't work with them anymore.
And therein lies my next question. Are you prepared for the furore that this is likely to encounter in terms of people saying that you are rewriting history, you're ignoring, you know, the Holocaust, that you are making this man into a hero, etc., etc.?
No. Well, one, the man isn't a hero. He dies demented, tormented and betrayed in Argentina. His wife has left him. Bormann has dismissed him from history. There is no Holocaust denial in this. These were the worst, most evil, murdering, criminal gang in history. And the thing that makes me angry more than anything else is that so many of them were allowed to escape, including Adolf Hitler. I've been a journalist a very long time.
So
looked at the information.
I mean, can I just challenge it? So not escaped as a matter of accident, but were allowed to escape?
We're allowed to escape.
That's a different story altogether.
We're allowed to escape with a huge amount of the money that they'd stolen and raked from Europe, with incredible patents, with shares in companies. They set up almost 700 front companies overseas for when they left.
You've talked about the evidence you looked at with the Americans. What about the Russians? Have you actually balanced that? Because, of course, they were the ones closest to actually getting to him.
It's interesting. The BBC reporter that was embedded with the Russian forces, or the Soviet forces, actually arrived at the bunker, Thomas Cadet, who was a great reporter, Paris bureau chief before the war. Cadet, when he got there with the Russians, said they'd been handed 6 doubles of Hitler, and none of them were actually Hitler. And he says in his report, which was aired on the BBC at the time from a senior correspondent, that there was no proof at all that Adolf Hitler's body was found at the bunker. Stalin always said he'd escaped to Spain or Argentina, and it's now been proved that the skull fragment that the Russians hold, the FSB hold in Moscow, is female and 40, so it can't even be Eva Braun. And then people say, well, the jawbone is got to be Hitler's. Well, if it came from the same skull, how can it be?
History tells us that an insane Adolf Hitler committed suicide in a bunker in Berlin in 1945 with his wife, Eva. Rumours abounded about a daughter, Uschi, and a son, although there is no hard evidence for their existence. Eva Braun's brother-in-law, SS General Hermann Fegelein, was reported executed after being court-martialed in Berlin at the fall. No sunken U-boats have yet been found off the coast of Argentina. History also tells us that Martin Bormann, known as the Brown Eminence, and the man who Hitler said he needed to win the war, died in Berlin trying to escape in 1945, and that his body was found in 1972 and confirmed by German government DNA analysis in 1998. History does not tell us that Adolf Hitler lived in Argentina with his wife Eva and their children. But these people, all of whose testimony is real, swear that it's true. Carmen Torrentugui looked after him, his family and friends at the Estancia San Ramon in 1945. Olga Müller and numerous other people saw him and Eva at the Hotel Vienna in Mar Chiquita and elsewhere in Cordoba province in 1946. In 2008 she was told the Gestapo are still active and had her life threatened for talking to us. Catalina Gomero spent weeks in 1948 waiting on him in 2 properties owned by the Eichhorn family in Cordoba, at La Falda and Pan Azucar. She would take phone calls from him until 1962. Mafalda Batinic saw him for the 2nd time in her life in 1951 at a clinic in Comodoro Rivadavia. The first time had been in France in 1940. Hernan Ansin met him in Mar del Plata 5 times in 1953, when he worked for the Croatian Ustashi monster Ante Pavlic. Pablo Glocknik, a former Graf Spee sailor, was part of his security detail from 1946 to 1962. Dr. Otto Lehmann was his personal physician during the same period. The man who allegedly led Hermann Fegelein's court-martial, SS General Wilhelm Munk, says the last time he saw him he was alive and well. Fegelein's father said he would often call after the war to say he and the Führer were in Argentina and fine. Alicia Oliveira, a senior Buenos Aires lawyer, tells us she has met Hitler's daughter. In 2008, Captain Manuel Monasterio, who recorded Pablo and Dr. Lehmann's testimonies, received death threats as a result of our research. Martin Bormann arrived in Argentina in 1948. Pablo saw him at Inalco. Jorge Colotto met him in 1955 when Juan Domingo Perón greeted his long-term friend and paid his hotel bill in Buenos Aires. Araceli Mendez worked for him in Buenos Aires and spent almost 3 years rebuffing his advances. She kept pictures of him. The Argentine Federal Police kept a file on Bormann much of which was burnt in the 1960s, but documents remain, which we have, and prove he and his lover Alicia Magnus stayed at the Plaza Hotel. At least 30,000 Nazis, Ustashi, Croatia's bloodthirsty animals led by Ante Pavelic, and other European fascists fled to South America after the war. They were helped by the Perons, the Catholic Church, the Red Cross, and KLM under Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Adolf Hitler, the worst and most evil criminal of the 20th century, often used the alias Mr. Wolf. The name Adolf comes from the High German for noble wolf. His first mistress called him Wolf, and it was as Herr Wolf that he was introduced to Eva Braun. Hitler's yacht was called the Sea Wolf, and his personal plane the Flying Wolf. His field headquarters in East Prussia, the Ukraine and France all had the word wolf in the title. And Hitler escaped to Argentina. And it was there, 17 years after his alleged suicide in Berlin, at 3 p.m. on the 13th of February 1962, tormented, demented, and betrayed, the most evil man of the 20th century finally died. We were lied to.
Hitler sightings soon surface all over Western Europe. One Nazi pilot tells of spiriting his leader to Denmark. Other reports claim Hitler is disguised as a shepherd in the Alps, or as a dealer in a posh French casino. One of the most disturbing stories comes from Sweden. It says Hitler and his bride, Eva Braun, had 2 children and fled to be with them. The report revives fears of Hitler's spawn, training to lead a Nazi revival. For many, the story is chilling proof that Hitler's urge to destroy will live forever, even if in some other form.
He was viewed in the West as being something beyond human, something sheer evil. Was it really possible for him to be dead?
Then, in July 1945, the question of Hitler's whereabouts becomes more than rumor. It balloons into a propaganda weapon. When the war's victors meet outside Berlin, Joseph Stalin insists that Hitler is still alive. He suggests the German leader fled to Japan by U-boat, or perhaps to Spain, where Europe's last fascist, Francisco Franco, still rules. The accusations are an ominous sign that Stalin will use Hitler's disappearance to rattle his enemies.
Stalin, in his usual rather sphinx-like way, wanted to keep everybody guessing, to be able to make everybody uncertain, both in his own entourage and, of course, on the world stage, appealed to his vanity and his very perverse sense of humor.
Then, an intriguing clue surfaces that suggests Stalin may be onto something. A German U-boat pulls into a foreign port, not in Japan or Spain, but in the South American nation of Argentina. Argentina's Juan Perón is an open admirer of Hitler's regime, and the country is already home to many powerful Nazis. In the coming years, many more will arrive, including the wanted war criminals Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the death camps, and Joseph Mengele, dubbed Auschwitz's Doctor of Death. Was Hitler planning to join his henchmen in Argentina, and with them on Perón? Yet at first, no one suspects Perón of harboring Hitler. Under intense American pressure, Argentina had declared war on Germany in March 1945. There are also the 7,000 miles separating the two countries, a huge distance for Hitler to travel undetected. But 2 months after the war ends, Argentina and Rome fall under intense scrutiny when a pair of U-boats appears off the coast. The first, U-530, surfaces on July 10th. 5 weeks later, the second arrives. Reports immediately fly that Hitler has harnessed Nazi Germany's stealthiest weapon to make a nearly miraculous getaway.
This certainly caused quite a stir. Why would a U-boat come to Argentina after the end of the war unless there was some covert reason for it to do so?
The Argentines quickly turn the crews over to the Americans for questioning. At the U.S. National Archives, historian Tim Mulligan has uncovered the interrogators' files. They show that the first U-boat, U-530, was already at sea when Hitler disappeared.
U-530 had already been on mission since March of 1945. And in this case, the captain apparently persuaded the crew that perhaps their best option was to go to Argentina.
But the story of the second boat, U-977, raises more questions. U-977 does not leave its base in Norway until May 2nd, just as Russian soldiers are overrunning Hitler's bunker. Germany invaded Norway in 1940, and in May 1945, its armies still occupy the country. If Hitler does succeed in flying from Berlin, as the Russians suggest, he could flee to Norway. There, he could board U-977 before it sets off on May 2nd, with orders to patrol the North Atlantic. U-977 is not the only U-boat at sea at war's end. When most get news of Germany's capitulation, they surrender. But U-977 does not turn up for another 2.5 months.
Altogether, they were at sea 105 days. By contrast, the longest U.S. submarine patrol of all of World War II was only 84 days.
The journey's length leads many to believe U-977 took a detour. Perhaps it traveled to southern Argentina, or even the Antarctic, and dropped Hitler before it surrendered. Suddenly, South America is awash in Hitler sightings. Tips pour into FBI headquarters in Washington and set off alarm bells as high as the office of Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Adolf Hitler is on a ranch 450 miles northwest of Buenos Aires.
Is in Bogota, Colombia.
In room 1027, Continental Hotel, Argentina.
The tips warn of rich Nazi sympathizers and secret hangouts where Hitler is hiding. Fearful Hitler's Nazi party could re-emerge in the Americas. FBI agents will spend the next decade on the case and compile a file more than 700 pages thick.